Good morning, everyone. My name is Philip Maher. I'm with the Hydrometrics and Groundwater section of the EPA, and today I'm going to talk about Water Framework Directive groundwater status. And I'll explore the question, is groundwater status the whole truth and nothing but the truth? So groundwater status is regarded as the benchmark really for decision making on groundwater, but it shouldn't be just relied upon on its own. And this has been quite evident in recent years because on the one hand, groundwater status has suggested significant improvement in the condition of groundwater, but on the other hand, then water quality information is indicating a decline in overall water quality, including groundwater. So I'm going to look at the contrast between the status and the water quality results and see what that means in the context of groundwater management. Firstly, then, just to mention the overall water quality in Ireland based on the last EPA report of the period 2013 to 18. This is published at the end of last year. So water quality overall is getting worse. This is particularly the case in our rivers. You can see from the graph there that the percentage of high status surface water bodies has gone down. Correspondingly, the percentage of poor status surface water bodies has gone up. Back in the 1980s, we did have almost 15% of river sites classified as pristine. This unfortunately has reduced to less than 1% most recently. So you can see there that over time, we're really seeing quite a big decline. Nutrients then are the main water quality issue. In the most recent period, we can see that we had increases in nutrients in rivers, to the marine environment, and also nitrate in groundwater, which increased by 3.6 milligrams per litre in that period. The source then of these nutrients, so more people means more wastewater treatment plant discharges. We're also seeing more cattle and fertilizer use. These have all then led to the increases we're seeing in our waters. More specifically in relation to groundwater then, nitrate is the main water quality concern. In terms of groundwater as a pathway, high concentrations of nitrate in groundwater, these can discharge to our surface water and affect ecology. And then we know in terms of drinking water, high levels of nitrate in groundwater are harmful to human health. Some of the quantity issues, climate change, that's expected to lead to a reduction in seasonal groundwater levels, which then in turn affects surface water and the related ecology. And the over-abstraction of groundwater, this also affects then in a similar way drinking water and surface waters and associated ecology. So what policy and legislation is there to drive improvements or to improve water quality? The overall policy here, you could summarize that, so to keep the clean waters clean and then fix the remaining waters. And this really comes from the Water Framework Directive. So that's the overarching umbrella directive of the EU. The Groundwater Directive sits below that as a daughter directive. In Ireland then we have the National River Basin Management Plan, which implements much of the Water Framework Directive. And then the groundwater regulations give effect to the Groundwater Directive. And just to indicate there the three guiding principles of the groundwater regulations. So we've got the achieving good status, the prevent or limit, and the trend reversal objective. How is groundwater quality assessed in the Water Framework Directive then? So that's through a process called status assessment or classification. And this is a backwards looking audit of water quality, and it's undertaken in 6-year cycles, most recently for the 13 to 18 period then corresponding to the Water Quality in Ireland report. All water types are assessed, not just groundwater. Today I'm obviously going to talk about groundwater. And this information then, as I said, it's reported on by the EPA, and it's also used by the Commission to assess how well member states are getting on in terms of the goals of the WFD. But I suppose, where does status assessment fit into the wider water quality management? And does status assessment improve water quality? So status does feed into the next step of the process, which is called risk characterization. And put simply, risk characterization means finding out where the water quality issues are, identifying what the source of these issues is, figuring out why they're occurring, and then putting appropriate measures in place to fix them. So you can see this little graphic here. So characterization looks forwards, status then looks backwards. It's currently underway then for the third cycle, with the next plan to be released in 2021. And just the final point there, so status is really an input to characterization. Characterization is the key step in improving water quality. Groundwater status then more particularly, so the WFD is prescriptive in that it sets out a series of tests that determine the chemical and the quantitative status of a groundwater body. Threshold values then are used in that assessment, and ultimately the assessment then assigns each groundwater body as either good or poor status. And that EPA guidance document there has a detailed explanation. I just then wanted to mention each of the status tests and the input data that's used. So for the chemical status there, the first test looks at whether there are saline intrusions in the groundwater body. Secondly, are there pollutants in the groundwater impacting on an associated surface water body? This primarily looks at phosphate in groundwater and surface water. And then the third one, are pollutants in groundwater impacting on an associated groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystem? The drinking water protected area test looks at whether pollutants in groundwater are affecting drinking water supplies. And the general chemical test looks at whether chemicals in groundwater are causing a deterioration in groundwater quality. There's a range of input data then. The most important there is probably the groundwater monitoring program. That national program is the main source then for the chemistry data from across the country that feeds into the chemical side of the status assessment. Looking at the quantity side of things then, the first test is similar to the chemical, but it just looks at whether abstractions are causing the intrusions. The number two, again, similar, are abstractions leading to impact in the surface water body. And similarly, number three, are abstractions leading to impacts on a GWDTE. And then the water balance test. So this assesses whether the combined abstractions of the groundwater body are greater than the natural recharge. So is more coming out of the groundwater body than is going in naturally. On the input data then, on the input data, just draw your attention to the abstractions register. So many of you will be familiar with this. So this requires anyone who abstracts over 25 cubic meters per day to register that abstraction with the EPA. And I just ask if any of you are involved in any well installations or any other abstractions, that you'd remind the abstractor that they need to register an abstraction of over 25 cubic meters per day with the EPA. So this then gives us our quantitative status, and then the combined quantitative and chemical is the overall status. Either good or poor, and we've got what's known as the one out, all out rule. So if one test is failed, if one test results in poor status, then the overall groundwater body status is also poor. Large point sources then, so these are, for example, licensed EPA licensed industrial and waste sites. They have their own set of rules for whether they're considered to be significant pressures and therefore whether they're assigned good or poor status. So there are three main criteria then which status is assessed against. Just to mention, this is detailed in EPA guidance. So these criteria, just to mention, these assume already that the site is in breach of the prevent or limit objective and that groundwater concentrations at the site exceed generic assessment criteria. And this is typically the case then for licensed sites with any appreciable history of contamination. So what's assessed then? Is there an expanding plume on the site? Is the plume greater than 2 kilometers squared? Is the contamination having an impact on groundwater related receptors? And then finally, do contaminant concentrations exceed 100 times the threshold value? And this last point is the main trigger for industrial or waste licensed sites in Ireland being assigned a significant pressure. So this is typically the one that causes contaminated licensed sites to fail. A quick summary then of the results. I won't go into these in detail, just to say that there has been a gradual improvement in groundwater status since the first assessment, 2009 there. And in the most recent assessment, 92% met their good status objective, which was equivalent to 98% of the country by area. And just to break down some of the poor status ones a little bit more then, there was 38 overall chemical with poor status. The general chemical being the most numerous. So this includes, for the vast majority of these, are licensed industrial and waste sites and mines. And two groundwater bodies failed on the drinking water test. This was due to high levels of nitrate. On the quantitative side of things, just 2 groundwater bodies failed. The water balance test was the Bettystown groundwater body. So clearly, there's 2 sort of stories here. As we see, the water quality picture is getting worse, but the status assessment is telling us that groundwater quality is improving. So I just wanted to use these maps here to compare these 2 things. So you've got status on the left-hand side there, and some water quality, some nitrate results on the right-hand side. So that shows the difference in nitrate concentration between 2013 to 2018. The red and orange dots, basically, you may not be able to make out the exact detail of that, but red and orange is basically bad. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the scale and the detail of the status assessment compared to the individual groundwater quality data is different. On the left, you see the status assessment. It indicates that only 2% of the country is in poor status, where if you contrast that with the right-hand side map, you can see lots of red dots there, orange dots around the country. And, we know that the water quality, the nitrate concentrations are increasing. Water quality is getting worse, in other words. So status really is the broad brush. It lacks the fine detail of the individual water quality assessment. Does status then provide us with the whole truth and nothing but the truth? So it doesn't, it doesn't provide us the full picture. What status is. It is a useful indicator for high-level regional assessment. It does provide crucial information for the next cycle, or for the next step, which is characterization. It is the way that member states are measured by the Commission, and because of that, status can be overly focused upon, or the importance of status on its own can be overly focused upon. However, if we want to have a full picture of water quality so that we can improve it, then we need to look at not only status, but also these other sources of information. Some of the limitations for of surface water management, some of the limitations of status for water management. So as we mentioned, it looks back. It's an audit of previous water quality data. It doesn't look forward. That's what characterization does. It's broad and based on the one out, all out rule. So you could still have good quality water under one test, but however the water body fails because of this one out, all out rule. And it's important then to look at the context behind why a water body has been classed as poor, to understand the story behind that, because to improve the water quality and manage the water quality, you need to understand those things. Just to reiterate then, we should be looking at groundwater status results in conjunction with other sources of information. So just to illustrate some of the limitations of status through interpreting water quality data. In terms of water quality then, if we consider nitrate, so we know that nitrates is a significant pressure. We saw earlier that it resulted in 2 poor status groundwater bodies. But we also know then that the water quality results are showing an increase in groundwater nitrate concentrations. Several water supplies have closed due to nitrate problems, and there may be long-term consequences for the health of our surface water because of elevated nitrate. But the issue then here is that because status only looks backwards, if we relied on that alone to take action, it would be too late. In other words, the impact would have already occurred. So this is why we have to consider characterization, in other words, the forward-looking aspect as well. In terms of phosphate then, use that as an example. So overall, the water quality picture indicates that it is stable with a reduction in groundwater seen recently. And the groundwater status reflects that we didn't have phosphate being a significant pressure on any groundwater bodies. And these improvements are generally in the catchment with thin soils and a high degree of karstification. Phosphate in surface water is still a concern in catchments with heavy soils and intensive farming, relatively intensive farming. So in these type of catchments, overland flow is a dominant diffuse phosphate transport pathway. And the groundwater status assessment doesn't take account of that pathway. It just looks at phosphate in groundwater discharged into surface water. So status lacks that the inside of the conceptual model. It's not helpful in this scenario because it's not pointing us in the right direction. In terms of point sources, large point sources, so like the EPA licensed industrial and waste sites, these can be at good status, but they can still have some local pollution issues because of residual impact from the activity that remains in groundwater. And so status isn't accounting for that type of local contamination. In relation to E. coli, so we know that that's a significant water quality issue and in groundwater, but it's not, pathogens aren't considered directly by the WFD, and therefore they're not reported on in the status assessment. WFD does indirectly consider those in relation to drinking water under the revised Drinking Water Directive. For hazardous substances and pesticides, then the EPA conducts screening analysis every 6 years. Most recent one is being completed this year in 2020. Based on previous results, we've seen that very few of these substances are found in groundwater, and if they're found, they're at very low concentrations. However, there can still be a localized concentrations of these types of chemicals. So it's important to be aware of that and not just assume that because the groundwater scale assessment is okay, then locally will be okay too. Water quantity in terms of abstractions. Over abstracting groundwater we know can impact flow and levels and associated ecosystems. And we know that some public water supplies are over abstracting at a local scale. In other words, they're unsustainable abstractions. These types of localized over abstractions aren't going to be captured necessarily in the, for example, the water balance test because of its scale. It's at the groundwater body scale. But it is important to manage these types of unsustainable abstractions, particularly in a holistic way. So that means looking at groundwater and surface water together. Climate change then is expected to lead to an increase in the differences between seasonal water levels. In other words, bigger differences between high levels in winter and low levels in summer, along with the associated ecological impacts. The status assessment, however, is based on an assessment of annual or 6-year averages. So it's not a good method of identifying these differences as it averages them out. These these issues, there's an awareness of these issues at the European level, and changes are currently being considered to address them. So finally, just to quickly go through my conclusions. So status doesn't give us the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It is an audit or look back at the past condition of water quality, and we need to look at water quality trends and information and pressures as part of characterization to look forward to better manage water quality. So we shouldn't look at these information sources in isolation, but in combination. And it's important then that decision makers don't rely on status alone as the only source of information. So I'd just like to say thanks to all my colleagues at the EPA who have worked with me on these projects, and thank you very much for your attention today.